Hello, hello. I'm Kier.
And I'm Liam.
And this is Hot Take Think Tank, a podcast for culture war dropouts about awkward trade-offs in the pursuit of progress.
So first up this week, we wanted to talk about your most recent essay, The Limits of Consent. Yeah, did you want to introduce it, or?
Sure. Yeah. I started off by talking about how, the Me Too moment provided a lot of language to identify, coercive or deceitful attempts at intimacy, but it didn't really shed much light on experiences in a gray area, right? That are awkward or uncomfortable or even regrettable, but that everyone agreed to, And I even feel like it possibly muddied those experiences because, there seemed to be sort of a binary coming out of Me Too that could put awkward experiences into the category of assault, even if they don't really make sense there.
Totally. That's what your essay made me think, that so much, the idea of some things are binary and some things are spectrums. And when you try and take a spectrum and turn it into a binary, you lose a lot of nuance that might be very important.
Yeah, totally. And I heard from a couple of readers who were kind of saying this essay kind of puts words to things that I've been kind of grappling with, right?
Right, totally. I think I saw a comment on your Instagram from someone just commenting about drunken hookups and how that they'd thought of that as a fun thing they did in their youth or whatever. But the Me Too movement sort of casts that all as a very dark event that could happen to someone.
Yeah, sort of that it shouldn't happen at all, or and the other thing is I don't know, talk around alcohol always seemed to be oh yeah, one person's going to get the other person super drunk and then take advantage of them, whereas I think it's a lot more common that both people get drunk, and often both people intend to get together and get drunk to facilitate that, right? So
yeah, I feel it's a weird it's like a rule set designed for a system that is so far from how the world kind of works.
Exactly.
I don't know. I live not that far from the nightlife district in our city, and it's there are definitely hordes of people every weekend who show up explicitly to get drunk and have sex.
Yeah.
And so to define the rules of the game, where it's no one is ever allowed to have sex while drunk, is it's just your rules are going to miss the whole game. You're gonna have a hard time convincing people to go along with that rule set if it's so far from their experience.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so that I went on to kind of talk about several different ideas within consent discourse that I feel deserve some criticism.
Right.
Go read the essay if you want the details. But yeah, the three were that there needs to be an enthusiastic yes, that every type of interaction requires consent, and that consent prevents harm, period.
Right.
Yes.
Those are sort of three aspects where you think the idea is stretched a bit further than it makes sense.
Yeah, well, because again, if we want people to have better sex lives, then we have to come up with guidelines that are actually applicable to people's real lives, right?
Totally.
And aren't some sort of ideal that we're supposed to measure ourselves against and that we're always falling short of. And I heard from another reader who has OCD that glommed onto this idea of consent being this very specific thing, this very verbal thing, right? No ambiguity is allowed. That's gonna drive some people a little crazy.
Totally. Yeah, and I did think it was interesting too, the thought that if consent is sort of put forward as this the cornerstone of it all, that experiences that are unsatisfying in one way or another, the person might end up looking for what went wrong with the consent that caused this disappointment. And that might not be helpful to sort of track down what, how to make things better next time. And I guess it could also get people in trouble or cause unnecessary strife in relationships, to sort of heighten what could have just been a mistake or something sloppy and sort of
heighten
it to this,
misunderstanding.
this like legal language, right? Of like consent and assault and, I don't know. They're very big words to throw around. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember where I heard this and have not fact checked it. So saying that first. But I heard that like in the years following Me Too, that about half of the Title IX complaints filed, which in the United States is sort of the department that takes care of this area, sexual assault and harassment. Right. Over half of the complaints were made against international students. Huh. And if that is true, it raises a lot of questions, right? It's like, were some of those just really unfortunate, like, cultural clashes and misunderstandings?
Totally.
I'm sure, and not that there's a clean line between, like, being treated poorly and, cultural misunderstandings, but that it's like, if the number is that big, like, I don't know, it kind of shines a spotlight on that, like, wait a second, like, is it because these norms are particularly American and other people are not familiar with them when they arrive on campus, or like, what? Yeah, what's going on with that?
Yeah, I do feel like there is an aspect to like the Me Too sort of explanation of the case that that these issues are all like very settled and universal and clear cut in a way that I don't think they are, and I think the differences between different countries exemplifies that very well. That like there are lots of places where I don't know, the idea of like asking for consent before kissing someone would be seen as odd, or like no one would ever do that, sort of, right? So the idea that it's like we've uncovered the universal right way to do things, and it's this way that only ever really happens in these weird sub communities.
Absolutely. And I think like there just are these norms that are sort of shifting or up in the air, right? It's like, if someone like flirts with you and asks for your number and you don't want to give that, like that feels like harassment. Some people call that harassment, right? Being approached when they don't want to be. But like, do we want a world where no one can ever approach anyone and we have like zero tolerance for the expression of interest? Like,
yeah, totally. It can get to an absurd degree, for sure. I was reading this week an article about the divergence in political beliefs between young men and young women. And your article really, I was thinking of it the whole time I was reading this other article, just because there's been this shift of young men towards the right generally, and young women towards the left generally, to the point where it's like the young men of today are like as conservative as like the 70-year-old men. Like every generation was more liberal until this most recent one. That trend has sort of turned around. And I don't know. I obviously wouldn't put that all at the feet of Me Too. What I was reading suggested a lot of it comes down to like educational achievement differences. But I do think it's something that sort of gets memed in that like right-wing young man part of the internet or whatever, is the idea that all of a sudden you're not allowed to even look at a woman or else you'll be accused of something terrible and your life will be ruined, right? It's sort of like when you are it's one of the things to be worried about when you're pushing something that can be taken to these extreme conclusions, is that people will use that as fodder to sort of build movements in the other direction.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, when I was like fully in the social justice subculture, like I would have been like, that's ridiculous. Like false accusations are super rare. Like that that basically doesn't happen, right? That's like, those people are just like, those men like just don't want to stop harassing people, right? Like that's what I would have said. But like I now have met many people who have had either false accusations or just like incredibly like distorted and exaggerated accusations made against them. And again, some of it, like, it's not necessarily malicious. Sometimes it is. But again, it can also come down to, it's like, yeah, if someone comes to believe that anyone staring at them is harassing them, like, then they're going to feel harassed a lot, right? And I mean, you have like women filming behind them and then putting it on TikTok to show people looking at their butts or that type of thing.
Oh, right? Okay, right. Yeah. Like, sorry, catching creeps or whatever.
Right. Like, yeah, catching creeps, as if, like, first of all, you can't even always tell exactly what these people behind them are looking at. And second of all, like, is it really actually creepy to look at someone when they don't see you looking at them? Like, is that actually a problem?
Right, totally. There is like this, elevating something that in the past would have happened without anyone noticing. Like, literally, it was not observable. And turning it into something that is being observed and then spread and shamed. It's a big shift.
I also saw someone point out that, like, maybe they're just wondering why there's a phone in your back pocket, like, with the camera sticking out, right? Like,
wait, is she filming me?
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like that's creepy in its own way. It's sort of creepy to go around with a secretly recorded camera pointing at strangers.
I think that is the creepy person in this situation, for sure. Yeah.
Totally. I think there's also a distinction to be made sort of between, I guess, I feel like this is something that comes up when we talk often, is the idea that it makes sense for institutions and individuals to treat things differently. And I feel like that comes into the consent conversation, where it's like, if you are law enforcement or, legislators or whatever it might be, I think the idea of, like, intent is irrelevant. I think that makes sense in the legal cases, right? Where it's about specific behavior, right? Like, was the word no said, that sort of thing. Whereas I think when it's just interpersonal, I think intent becomes a lot more relevant, where it's like, if someone actually was well-meaning and thought that everything was going good, and maybe they missed a sign, or took things too fast. I think in like an interpersonal situation, it makes sense to consider whether or not someone was sort of like acting with ill intent.
Yes.
Right?
I totally agree. Yeah, actually, I made a post on Instagram about intent mattering, and there was someone who said something about how, like, how important, like, what something does is. It's like this sociological idea, right? Like, an organization, like, it doesn't really matter what they say that they do. It matters what they actually do.
Right.
And I was like, I think interpersonal relationships are way more complicated than that. I think, like, if you're evaluating like a policy or an organization, that's a reasonable idea, right? What is the actual work that's being done? But you cannot possibly, like, apply that to a date, can you? Like,
no, well, that's the thing, is, like, if you want to turn something into policy or legislation, you have to flatten it and define your terms and come down one side or another. That's the point of the policy, right? Is to make a clear line that HR can go into, right? But that is no way to, like, be a human on your own. Like, I don't know, you don't want to come up with like blanket policies that that help you, like, categorize things correctly. That's sort of like not how.
No.
I don't think that would be a particularly, like, healthy approach to most things in life. And it's because as humans we're, like, capable of nuance and, like, we're capable of more than, like, simple categorization and, like, punishment or reward. Like, our relationships are complicated, and that's a good thing that we can can let our relationships get deeper through.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also, like, any relationship, there's, like, multiple people who have agency and have desires and have needs, and, like,
right, totally.
So, like, barring, like, a completely wild power dynamic, like in jail or something like that, like, someone can feel like, oh, this person did this thing to me, and that person's like, no, I didn't. Like, there can be, like, reasonable disagreement about, like,
totally.
whose fault something is, or like who participated in what to what degree, or how clear you were about saying how you were feeling.
Totally.
You know, like there is ambiguity there, no matter like how you wanna like you just can't simplify that, right? Like,
totally. Yeah, there's a great section in one of my favorite books, Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, a book about cognitive dissonance that goes into this sort of topic. And I think particularly like on college campuses, where there's plenty of drinking and plenty of sex and plenty of accusations sort of going around. The idea that like talking to people who are familiar with that scene, people who study it, they refer to it as a dance of ambiguity. That like sexual relationships usually intentionally are very ambiguous, sort of with the goal of let everyone sort of like get away with their ego intact, right? Like you don't proposition so directly that you're forcing them to reject you, right? You sort of like make a move, see how they respond, right? And like it's a dance of ambiguity, which
That's
goes
so fascinating,
so far against the idea that like the enthusiastic yes. It's like most people don't want to ask for that because they don't want to. It's like it's a weird almost contradiction, right? Because asking for that enthusiastic yes is almost a little coercive.
Right.
In that it's like, well, if you don't want to do this, you have to hurt my feelings right now. Whereas the dance of ambiguity lets everyone sort of get away without hurting feelings. That's like its purpose, maybe.
Absolutely. Like I've had long-term partnerships where like the other person was shy and like there was never an enthusiastic yes, because that's not how things were initiated, right? Like,
yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. If that's literally like how young people tend to like enter intimacy is like in this ambiguous way. The other thing I was thinking about, and I don't know if it's in that book you mentioned, but just the idea that like when we do something regrettable, we're like, oh, well, you know, we have the context for it. We're like, well, I was having a bad day, or like my dog was sick, or whatever. Like there's reasons I acted that way, right? Whereas like when someone that we don't know does something crappy,
right,
we think it's because they're a bad person and they have like ill intent.
Totally. Yeah. No. Totally. It's a big part of that section was actually about memory and how memories are sort of a lot more shifting and changing than people assume. And that they usually shift in the direction of making yourself feel better. However that might go. And particularly alcohol makes memories very susceptible to being like changed and then solidifying in a very unreliable sort of state. And just the idea of like confusing a feeling that you want to object with openly objecting is a pretty common thing, it seems. That they like, oh, I don't know about this. Did I say that out loud? Did I say I don't know about this? And like whether or not you remember having said it might depend on other factors, like, you know, did you have a good time? Did you find out this guy's a jerk for another reason?
Right. Later,
do you regret it and wish you hadn't done it? Now that I think about it, I think I didn't mean to do it. I think I said I wasn't going to do it, you know? It's like this very, very messy, sort of like self-justification, not in every case, but in many cases.
Right. Yeah, and like not in a way where we're like, I am going to plot against this person and change how I think about the connection that we had. Haha. Like, no, it's way more like inadvertent than that, right? Totally. That the things that we learn after the encounter can like color how we feel about it.
Well, and then it does also happen on the other end of it, right? The accused, I guess we're talking about, will also remember like, no, there's no way you would have said that and I wouldn't have picked up on it. Like I would have stopped if you said, right? And it's and then those memories go the other direction, right? And you end up like it was this like dance of ambiguity that like solidifies sometimes into like a strong disagreement where we both have very specific memories of what happened and they don't agree at all. And someone It's weird. I always think of that, like the word lying has like intent behind it.
Right.
So it's like I wouldn't even say either person in that situation is lying necessarily. They're both just, remembering, and their memories are like self-justifying, and they've drifted apart, and now they, without either of them lying, they are saying two things that can't possibly be true at the same time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I really hadn't thought too much about like how the fallibility of memory kind of fits into all this. But that really sort of reinforces like my concern around the idea that consent prevents harm, period, right? Because it's like, I just really don't want young people that are starting to experiment to think that if I feel disappointed or bad or regretful or whatever afterwards, something was done to me. Like I was violated in some way because I feel bad afterwards, right? Like I just think that that's like an impossible bar for us to set, that like,
totally,
you know, starting now, all young people will only have good sexual encounters thanks to consent. And, you know, if you don't have that, then like, yes, an assault has taken place, right? Like,
totally.
And I know that that like may sound like so over the top or whatever, but like I've heard stories like either personally recounted to me or through the news that shows that like, there really is some, I don't know, some like heightened fear around issues of consent post Me Too. I think that's fair to say.
Totally. Yeah. And well, I feel like, I do think that maybe like the great things that come out of the Me Too movement was just the like mass communication of the idea that no means no.
Yeah.
Which seems intuitive, but I don't think it is for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I think it's great. Like there's just that like no one at this point is like, confused about like even just confused about what the law says even. Right? I think that's a big pro, right? The idea of, I don't know, like you watch so many like old romantic movies and you're like, this is terrible what this man is doing.
Yeah. This
right?
is
And
not romantic.
You could see watching those movies and taking away a lesson of like, you know, the way to a woman's heart is to just keep pushing.
Yeah.
So I think I think that's like the big net positive was just like a blanketing the world with the idea of like, if someone says no, you gotta stop.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, I even feel like as a young person, like I didn't even necessarily believe that completely, that no meant no, right? It's like, well, if someone's like saying no, but like their body language is saying otherwise, or maybe they're saying no like in a jokey way or whatever, right? Like, because there was no talk about consent like in my like sex ed at all, like because my teenage years were previous to that. Like it just it wasn't even just men, it was just in general, like there was like a lot more of a weird sort of like idea that it could be like a weird cat and mouse game or something, which I think a lot of the romantic comedies you're talking about, like it's that, right? It's like never take no for an answer, just like keep
so many
pushing.
Like the great romantic moments from cinema, you watch them now and you're like, oh, he shouldn't be doing that. Standing outside her window with the boombox after she said no that many times, that's right. You should move on. So I do think it was good to sort of clarify that idea in many people's minds. I'm curious, Kier, because you mentioned at the top of your article that you sort of went through many things before the Me Too movement happened, that once Me Too had happened, you like looked on them in a different light. Yeah. I'm sort of curious if you think, if you're like worried at all about people who have similar experiences now, sort of in the post-Me Too era, and who maybe instead of like shrugging them off as a shitty thing that happened, because of this like cultural reframing, take it a lot more seriously than might be beneficial to them, I guess. Not that, they should be accepting of it, but just like in a way that makes their own life more difficult. for taking things more seriously?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah. So for listeners who haven't read the article, like some examples of this are like having my butt grabbed at work at 16, or like having this guy threaten to rape me at a party I was at, like those types of things.
Bad things.
Bad things, period.
Yeah, you said you just sort of like chalked them up to... Yeah, just chalking them up to people being shitty.
Yeah. And yeah, so when Me Too happened, I was like, oh, there are words for those things. That like, obviously in the moment I found them disturbing, but like, I also just shook them off really quickly, because I didn't think there was anything to be done. And I actually I don't know that it would have been more beneficial to me to feel like I had been really violated in those moments, right? Because I had more knowledge around consent and everything. Like if the exact same thing had happened with that knowledge, would I have felt more harmed by it?
Right, totally. I feel like that was a big part of the story, was like the untold harm of all these small things. Small, I guess, was the problem word there.
But I think it is small. Right. Like I'm willing to say having my butt grabbed is pretty small compared to like being raped, right? I think being threatened with rape is really small compared to actually being raped, right? So
right, totally. But I guess like the term Me Too comes from the idea that like every woman has a Me Too story. Like this also happened to me, and I guess again back to that flattening idea. But yeah,
totally. Because like I'm kind of happy that I shook those things off. I'm kind of happy that like I'm not haunted by them. I don't feel harmed by them, right? And so like I don't know, maybe it could have benefited me to like I don't know, see a therapist about it, talk about it, whatever. But I'm not sure. Like I think I am wary of like, because of the flattening that's happening, where it's like everything non-consensual kind of feels equally as loaded or equally as bad. It does concern me that like, because I don't know, I've had so many random things happen to me that like it would be debilitating if they all felt like this terrible, horrible, like life-shattering thing, right? Like I think I benefit from having a lack of fragility. And I think like an earnest one, right? Like if you're feeling hurt, but you're pretending you're not hurt, that's one thing. But if you're like, actually like, don't really care that guy grabbed my butt, like it sucks, but like I'm moving on. I think that there is a benefit to that. And I think like the fragility that I used to engage in was really bad for me. So I think it's like, it's kind of, it feels awkward to be like, we should take these things seriously, and address them and confront them, but also like it is okay if it didn't affect you that much. Like you don't need to like make this a big part of your identity. You don't need to like over identify with how you felt in that moment, and I hope that like we can hold that complexity where it's like people do have different responses to being harassed or assaulted, and that can include like just being annoyed and then getting over it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like there's another whole spectrum, right, of ways that people react to that sort of thing. And it's not that any is like the better or right way to react. But like specifically, that's the point, is that there isn't a good or bad way to react. How you react is how you react. And if that happens to be shrugging it off, that's okay.
There you go. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of how like most people who go through traumatizing events don't develop PTSD. That's like a minority reaction, and that doesn't mean those people are like weaker or whatever, right? Like, but it means that like a lot of people in a lot of situations are very resilient, and they can carry on after something really horrible happens.
Yeah, totally. Well, should we transition to something else about horrible things happening to people?
Yes, I was going to say, speaking of horrible things, There's another cough for you, Laser. One thing that I really love about having left my social justice echo chamber is that I am free to really try and understand positions that I do not hold.
Right.
Because I'm no longer scared of like being contaminated by bad ideas. I'm like okay with changing my mind, and I actually think it strengthens my positions to like not coddle my beliefs, but actually like challenge them by learning about the other side. So the article I wanted to discuss today is by Olivia Reingold for the Free Press, and it's called "How Abortion Became the Defund the Police of the GOP."
Ooh. Good title.
Yeah, good title. And the subtitle is "Republican Leaders Thought They'd Be Rewarded for Overturning Roe. Instead, conservative voters tell Olivia Reingold it could lead to a backlash come Election Day."
Yeah, very interesting article. Basically, I felt like I was just detailing like Republican after Republican who was feeling real iffy about this whole abortion ban thing.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's super interesting because, again, it comes back to the idea that, like, oh, our side has such a diversity of opinion and so much nuance and complexity and blah, blah, blah. But, of course, the other side is just a bunch of wingnuts or whatever. And so I think this is super interesting. Like, I think most pro-choicers would not consider a coalition with Republicans that are coming to doubt their pro-life position, or perhaps just feel like the pro-life legislation that's going through is just going much further than they can support, right?
Right.
Yeah, so one of the things that really kicked this off is the recent ruling by the Alabama Supreme Court, which has ruled that frozen embryos are children under state law.
Right. Right. So yeah, that's how the article starts, right? Is that like this woman who's like pro-life being like, oh, that's great. Yeah. Embryo. They're now considered babies. That's perfect. And then like reading into the night, the article's like what it actually means and being like, oh God, no. Yeah, totally. It's like when you're pro-life, I guess you read that something is, that unborn children or whatever, is that what they call them, unborn babies?
Yeah.
Like get their legal rights, you're like, yes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with like the actual details of the case every time.
Absolutely. Well, and this one is particularly funny, right? Because it's like it's super common for embryos to be destroyed in the IVF process, right? There can be genetic abnormalities, they can be no longer needed. So this ruling actually caused a bunch of in vitro fertilization clinics to just close their doors, period. Because
I think all of them, all of the ones in Alabama were like, we can't operate under these circumstances.
Well, can you imagine, right? Like the legal liability now that they each have like hundreds or thousands of unborn babies like in their clinics, right?
Totally.
Like,
yeah, and it's at the level of like madness. They're like officially operating as daycares or whatever. It's totally. It's absurd. Well, and when the planned procedure is like involves regularly having embryos die in their care, like that, they've never been set up to ensure that every single embryo lives a full and happy life. That's and
like they couldn't do that.
No.
Right? That's
and
not,
also,
that's
why
not
would
possible.
they? It's absurd. Like
can you imagine? So there was a huge immediate backlash to the point that like the Republican governor, Kay Ivey, rushed to sign a bill that would, quote, provide civil and criminal immunity for death or damage to an embryo to any individual or entity when providing or receiving services related to in vitro fertilization. The companies that provide any goods to IVF clinics are still vulnerable to civil suits. If those goods are shown to have destroyed embryos. So it's not clear that this bill doesn't do enough, basically, to reassure clinics that they're going to be able to operate. So some have reopened, some have not reopened. But yeah, it's like this weird sort of Band-Aid solution that doesn't actually address like the underlying issues that were caused by the Supreme Court ruling.
Right, because I guess the way to address them all would be to say definitively that embryos are not babies, which is a counter to the pro-life thing, right? Like it's a very red state. The reason this happened at all, right, is because the state is trying to make fetuses and embryos into babies under the law, right? And now they're trying to like carve out an exception for this one case, which is way messier than just leaving embryos as not children in any case.
Yeah, well, and the mother that you mentioned, Kelly Stafford, who is a 37-year-old lifelong Republican, she had her child through IVF after 8 years of trying. So that's why, like, when she first heard this, she's like, oh, like, you know, test tube babies are like being recognized, you know. But then she realized, like, she has 8 frozen embryos, like, stored still, right?
Right.
So, like, she's like, she was going to donate them to science, but now she's like, could I be charged with manslaughter for doing that? Like, and that's a serious question. Like, she's not being alarmist. That's literally, like, what one of the implications of this ruling could be, right? And she just found that, like, so absurd that she's not planning on voting for any of the currently sitting Republican judges on the Alabama Supreme Court in November.
Yeah, and I guess that's how it sort of connects to the title idea of abortion being the defund the police of the GOP, right? The idea that it's like this sort of largely unpopular movement within a big political party that will cost votes in the election if sort of the establishment goes too far with it. I guess that's the parallel, sort of.
I think so, yeah. I was trying to figure out what was meant by the title, right? The Defund the Police of the GOP, which was written by conservative commentator Ann Coulter, because it doesn't explain it at all. In the article. But I was... A couple parallels that I found were, you know, it's a policy that's only supported in full by a very small minority in the party. Like, although like a less extreme version is more widely popular, it's also like a slogan that flattens and oversimplifies like concerns that are real. But it also like alienates the moderates in the party who are like, wait, hang on a second. Like, you know, because there are 5 states since the overturning of Roe v. Wade that have outlawed abortion, including in cases of rape and incest.
Right.
And that is a policy, the rape and incest part, that is not supported by like 76% of Republicans. Right, like 76% of Republicans
need those
want
exceptions in there.
Exactly. So there seems to be that real disconnect between the Republican base and what the politicians think that the base want.
Right, totally. Or it's like it could be a case of sort of like I don't know, squeaky wheel gets the grease almost. Like the only people writing into their Congress people about pro-life issues are the ones who are really, really into it. And the majority who, I don't know, don't think about it that much are just like, oh yeah, well of course you need those exceptions in there, you know? But they're not like writing in about that because it's not front of mind, right? It's not something they're like, you know, they're not protesting for it because it just seems like a sensible thing and they go about their day.
Well, and Liam, I feel like you often bring that up when we do discuss abortion, that like this is like a non-issue in like most European countries.
Yes.
It's like barely an issue up here in Canada, for example. Like Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, has said that he is pro-choice. His wife has said he's pro-choice. His, you know, history shows that maybe it's not that simple, but like it is so unpopular in Canada to like the idea of like challenging abortion that like not even the Conservative Party is like willing to do that. Right.
Totally. Yeah. I actually, for this episode, I made myself a little spreadsheet of the abortion policies in the G7 countries. So that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and United States.
Interesting.
And it is. It's pretty interesting. It is. As far as I can tell, a pretty settled debate in most countries, but there's like variety amongst us all. In Canada, we apparently don't have. It's not even a legislated topic. It comes down entirely to the professional organizations.
Interesting. So it's treated as a medical procedure.
Yeah, exactly. Like the doctors' organization gets to decide what their members should and should not do. And I think it's something like a 21-week limit, something around there. Mm-hmm. And then France is no limit in certain cases, 16 weeks in others. Germany, no limit in some cases, 12 weeks in others. And it just sort of varies, but they're all the United States is definitely the outlier in that risk to health is permitted everywhere else, sort of as a reason to have an abortion, and that now varies in the United States. Same with rape, fetal impairment everywhere but Japan. That's a fine reason to end a pregnancy. And then economic or social reasons also is permitted everywhere except for the United States.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, so I found it interesting kind of in two ways, maybe. Both that it's like nowhere. I feel like it's become such a divisive issue in American politics that there are now like extreme values held on both sides in both parties that are more extreme than you'd find anywhere else. Like there's a weirdly large contingent of people who think that it should be banned in all cases, and a weirdly large contingent that think it should be allowed in all cases. Right. Which is not like no country does either of those pretty much.
Yeah. I actually listened to this interview with the New York Times columnist David French. It's on the Persuasion Substack with Yasha Monk. I listened to this a while ago, but I thought it was really interesting because Yasha Monk basically like wanted to understand like the pro-life argument. And one thing I thought was really interesting that David French said was basically it's like deciding when an embryo or a fetus like becomes a baby is like the science can't decide that for us, right? Like,
right.
It is such a gradual thing, the growth, right? That like it's always going to be sort of a philosophical position that you take, right?
Right.
Like,
there's never going to be like a blood test you can do that comes out baby or not baby.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Like it is ambiguous, period. Like, and people on the extremes of both sides will say it's not, but it is like, and so like perhaps what that means is that there's a compromise required, right? Like,
right.
That we can't listen to extremists on either side. That podcast mentioned a Harvard-Harris poll that showed that about 72% of Americans want to ban abortion by 15 weeks.
Right.
And that's really interesting, like 72%. And that's of Americans in general. That's not specifically Republicans or Democrats, right? So that's approaching like 3/4 of people that agree on that 15-week mark, right?
Yeah.
That's interesting to me.
It isn't.
Because
yeah, totally.
Like how do you ever settle this without a compromise?
Yeah. Or I mean also why would that be the goal, I guess? I don't know. I think there's something interesting about like what happens in a democracy when something very unpopular becomes policy. Because like there will be more elections, right? And I guess the 2022 midterms, a lot of people attribute like the lack of a red wave to like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, right? And it's like this, is there, it doesn't help the people who are like currently living in the states where abortion is banned, but is there some like reversion to the mean sort of, right? Like that eventually on average on a long enough time scale, the policy will like align with what the voters want it to.
Well, and I think there are some hopeful signs. It's hard, right? Because some people I know feel really hopeless about this, but reading this article, I'm like, this is super interesting because, like, first of all, Republican voters are way less intensely pro-life than I thought they were, and than Republican politicians seem to think they are. Nearly 40% of Republicans support abortion in all or most circumstances, for example. Yeah. I don't know what you would have... I should have made this into a quiz and gotten you to guess first. But yeah, like, that's much higher than I would have guessed. And here's the thing, like, some red states are actually rejecting abortion bans. Like...
right. Yeah, the places where, like, they need to put it to the public in order to alter the Constitution or whatever. I think... I haven't heard about one of those actually getting through yet.
Yeah.
I think 57,
57% of Ohioans voted to grant a constitutional right to abortion, of which 25 to 30% were Republicans. Ohio supported Trump in the last two elections. Kentucky and Kansas, who also voted Trump in the last two elections, rejected abortion banning referendums. And 210,000 Republicans in Florida have signed a petition to put abortion access to a vote.
Interesting. Right.
Isn't it?
I think, yeah, totally. It's, I don't know. That seems kind of promising. But I do also wonder, like, how much the debate would be doused by just, like, reasonable compromise legislation. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't take either extreme position, but like a 16 or 20 or 22 week, like after that ban with exceptions, seems like it might make a majority of people feel good about where the country's at on abortion legislation.
Yeah, I think it would.
Which,
I also just think it's interesting because, like, it can feel like these culture wars that, like, they're as old as time or whatever.
Right, yeah.
But they're not. One of my favorite journalists is John Ronson, and he has a BBC show called Things Fell Apart, and it's essentially a history of the American culture wars. And it's super interesting because basically he argues that fighting for the unborn was a strictly Catholic issue prior to the 1980s. Because it was 1979 when Frank Schaeffer, this filmmaker, created basically an anti-abortion propaganda film. It's called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. You can watch it on YouTube. There are, like, ghostly haunted children and dolls strewn across the desert, not at all subtle. But the funny thing is, like, Frank Schaeffer, his father was this very influential Christian art historian, Francis Schaeffer, and they'd made a previous film series called How Should We Then Live that was incredibly popular. They toured it around and, like, they were, like, selling out, every venue, showing this film this film series that was very, like, philosophical and reflective and so on. But it had a very small anti-abortion part, and people didn't like it. That was a Catholic issue. The Protestants, the evangelicals were like, this isn't our thing. So when Frank Schaeffer made this second film, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and tried to tour it, no one was showing up. No one cared. But what ended up happening is that, and I'm not sure if first there was media attention and then the feminists started picketing the film, or if the feminists started picketing the film, which brought it into the media.
Right.
But basically, once the feminists were picketing, evangelicals started showing up in droves to see what this film was all about.
Right. That they're picketing a Christian film of some sort, so it must be a good Christian film if it
exactly,
has them angry.
Right? Talking of like unintended consequences, right? Like, it's like, would have been better if you just stayed home. But so that film really sort of launched the Protestant focus on unborn children. So it's actually like a recent phenomenon. That's what I thought was like so fascinating. Like it's such a pillar of evangelicism in the last like several decades that it's hard to even imagine evangelicism without it, right? But
totally.
There was a time.
Yeah.
So
well,
maybe
it makes me think, could there be a time again?
Could there be a time again?
Yeah. If it used to not be important, then it's important. It seems like it could stop being important again.
Yeah.
But I feel like the one thing that would definitely keep it important would be something like super permissive legislation. Right? Like the thing that would douse the fire is like the reasonable compromise legislation where it leaves only the weirdos upset.
Yeah.
Right. But I feel like polling suggests that there are policy options out there that most people would be happy with. And if most people are happy with the policy, it makes it a lot harder to campaign on, because it's, hard to get people riled up about something where they're like, yeah, that seems all right.
That seems fine. Yeah.
And suddenly you're arguing like, no, that's 3 weeks too long, and it doesn't have the same bite,
That's so true. Like, social movements are so often doused by a compromise of some sort, or like, some type of reform that like doesn't give the demands of the protesters, doesn't give them everything they want, but does like acknowledge and kind of get partway there.
Yeah, speaking of, I did look into a bit, because it's there in the title, the Defund the Police movement. So I did look into it a bit to see like what came of that. One thing I learned was that the idea of defunding the police is like super unpopular, like about 16% support.
Oof.
Across the whole public, and I can't remember. It's something like 18% among Democrats, and
wow,
and 14 among Republicans or whatever. Like it's really, it's a bipartisan issue to not defund the police. But at the same time that sort of the defund the police movement was happening, there were a lot of other policies being considered other than just like cutting funding, that were very widely supported. De-escalation training, the same poll had at 88% approval.
That's great. Yeah.
Body cams at 87. Early warning system for problem officers had 80% approval, and just banning neck restraints had 67% approval. And again, more than 50% even among the Republicans, who are generally more opposed to that sort of thing. And so basically, again, it's a case where like there was this extreme part that was putting forward these unpopular policies, and then there's like a whole pile of pretty darn popular ideas that sort of try and get at the same thing, right? Because like the reason there were such big protests was that people were upset with how police were behaving. And one idea to solve that problem was to cut their funding. And then there were a bunch of other ideas. And broadly sort of looking at what policy changes happened, there were tons, mostly at like the state and municipal level. There were a few like federal bills in the states that, passed like one house of Congress, but not the other, that sort of thing. But yeah, like just city after city banning neck restraints, banning tear gas, updating their training programs, right? Having new whistleblower protections, body cam requirements. Like if you're ever going to discharge your firearm, you have to have your body cam on first.
Yeah.
That sort of thing seems to have pretty much swept all the big cities.
That's so cool.
Which is very
That's
cool.
Great. I love all that stuff.
Yeah. No, very. I was encouraged because I sort of because I feel like defund the police was like the headline policy, which largely didn't go very far. I sort of was under the impression that that whole like protest movement hadn't gone very far. But I sort of reading about it, I think it changed a lot of things in a relatively boring way compared to defunding the police. Mm-hmm. In terms of actual defunding, Minneapolis put it to voters. They said, like, we're willing to dismantle our whole police department and replace it with like a community safety department. And it lost the vote. Not by a huge margin, but by 10 points or something.
Wow.
So they still have a police department there. I think with some of the same reasonable reforms that happened all over the country. Mm-hmm. And then it looked like the NYPD and the LAPD did change their budgeting plans. Sort of in ways where it's like the people who were like about defund the police were like, that doesn't count as defunding the police. You're just redirecting funds to different parts of the same system or whatever.
Well, that's part of what was so confusing about the whole discourse around defund the police is because some people were saying, yes, we literally mean we're going to shut down the entire department.
Yeah, right.
Other people were saying, no. Like, we are saying defund the police, but what we actually mean is just like making some reforms or like reallocating certain funds or whatever. Like you could never like pin down what exactly was meant because defund the police period literally is profoundly unpopular. Almost no one wants that. Yeah. So then people kept like changing what it meant.
Totally. And like a damage control. It reminds me of in the 2016 election how like Trump would say some wild thing and people would be like, oh, he doesn't mean we should actually build the wall and that Mexico will actually pay for it. He means that like the border is really important to him and that he thinks Mexico has a role to play. And
right,
like,
exactly.
That's not what he's saying. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's this style of politics that I really don't like, regardless of if it's like a cause I believe in, where you're like, let's just like way overstate what we believe, just to like get everyone riled up. I'm like, please don't do that. I don't like it.
Agitation. There's a word for it, right? That's definitely what some groups or people see as their role. Political agitation. Yeah, it's
not us. I don't think that's our show.
Wouldn't catch me doing anymore.
Well, I think we should probably end it there. Although I have a few questions for you I didn't get to. We'll have to get to them in a different episode, I guess.
Oh, okay.
I imagine we'll talk about topics covered here again someday.
I think we will.
But speaking of answering questions, there's a survey on I don't know how you get to it. Kier, you want to take it from here? Do you know how to get to it?
Well, this survey is for hot take think tank listeners who are subscribed to the newsletter attached to the podcast. So if you got this episode in your email, you can head into that email and you'll find a link. If you're not signed up yet, you can go to kier.substack.com. That's kier.substack.com. Sign up to be a subscriber, and next Friday I will email you a link to the survey. And yeah, we're just curious to get your feedback on this podcast and the newsletter in general. And as we plan for the future, we'd love to incorporate your thoughts. So it would be great if you tuned in for that.
Yeah. I mean, if you have ways that you'd like the show to change or shift, it's still a very small show, but not, there's not that much of an audience. So like, your voice will be heard, you could say.
Yeah, we do.
One of not too many people, getting back to us on this. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, we do read every email, every comment, and we'll be looking closely at the survey results. So definitely let us know what you think.
Great.
Well, This has been Hot Take Think Tank. Until next time.